One of the things I hear most often from parents about their children is the fact that, oh, I wish they'd get outside. And of course, I just remember being one of those kids who was always outside, mainly because we didn't have technology to actually bother us. So it's really nice to find a school that has thought about this. And instead of having concrete courtyards, they've created a garden which will absolutely enhance any experience a child can have. A calm place amid the madness of the modern world. Just soothing those young minds. I'm meeting up with landscape designer Michael Rickhoff, who was responsible for creating this green oasis at Education Incorporated Boutique School. Michael, I love this garden. Now, tell me, what was here when you first arrived?
Essentially what we had here was a few sort of beds, I think, that from times gone by, and a little bit of lawn that wasn't really looking that good, but there was no structure or whatever to the garden. There were no paths or anything like that, so it was a little bit of lawn, a couple of old garden beds and whatnot, and the challenge to me was, do something with this.
So where does one actually even start with something like that?
Well, the first thing you have to look at is it's a school ground, and the minute it's a school ground, you have a totally different outlook in terms of what would you do with a residential property, and the first thing you look at is, well, what is the traffic going to look like? Where do people go to? So in other words, it's what we call the circulation, the pedestrian circulation, and that was the first thing I looked at. And it's what we call sort of function over form. Yeah.
But that's one of the first things that you're taught when you start learning about garden design is garden planning.
Yeah.
Where certain things take place in the garden, even if you've got dogs, where does the dog run? Where do people walk to get somewhere?
Yeah.
So, it just makes your brief a little bit harder because people, especially when there's lots of kids, are just going to go wherever. But this way you can actually direct them to places.
Yeah, so really what you need to look at is, are you fighting against the flow of traffic, or are you just designing with it? And what we did is we looked at all the entrances and the doors and the windows and so on, and where do people park, where are the offices, where are the classrooms? And we said, well, you have to have a pathway coming from all of those, because you'd prefer people to be walking on the pathway where they would walk anyway. And then what we said, because it was function over form, we said, well, then how do we introduce something sexy into that? How do we introduce some form into that? And that sense of mild gravitas that the school demands.
I was going to say, you use the word gravitas. I'm thinking kind of formal.
So yes, exactly. There is a feeling of formality in the look and feel of the garden. And when I say the look and feel, it's a sort of a classical formality. Because formality can take many forms. You can have contemporary formality. Here we have a classical formality in the sense that you have classical features, like the columns of the folly in the background, the columns of the sundial stands, the furniture and whatnot. It's all got that classical feeling to it, but it isn't symmetrical. It's not a symmetrical garden because the space itself doesn't lend itself to a symmetrical garden. But if you look at the geometries, the lines, the way the garden is divided up, yes, it definitely says classical formality.
So it's very different to when you think about schools where there's just grey concrete quads and nothing really for children to look at when they're at school.
Yeah, we wanted to have that softer feeling. So we maintained, and believe me, the lawn that you see around you here is a fraction of what was here before. And that is making sure that we only have as much lawn as is functionally sort of practical for us. But we did introduce a lot of planting beds, we introduced a lot of softness. And one of the landscapers' challenges is, how do you make a garden look good all year round? And we're standing here in winter, and the garden still looks lush and it still looks green. And it's not just a cool garden, it's a calming garden. You have calming water in the background, but the planting itself is calm, because a lot of green shades and a lot of the blues and whites coming through.
Do you think that gardening is something that children should be exposed to?
Well, absolutely. I don't know. I think that we evangelize a lot out there in the industry. We say, really we need to get children involved in gardening, and various garden clubs have tried to get children coming into gardening. And I think it's great at school level, to the extent where the school actually has their assemblies outside. So the children sit on the lawns, they're surrounded by this beautiful soft garden. They love the garden. Apparently the children love to sit in this garden. So, as you say, it's not an uncomfortable garden where children are going to find themselves a corner away from it all. They're part of it, they participate in the garden. It's an interactive space for the children. And yes, I think if you grow up in this sort of environment, you're going to grow up maybe wanting this in your own home in the future.
Yeah, I think specifically for those of us who weren't brought up in the time of technology, we used to spend all of our time outdoors, and I think maybe schools should be looking at incorporating that into what they do as well, getting kids outdoors. Yeah. So now the planting scheme, what does this place look like in spring and summer?
Well, that's just the thing. As I say, we're standing here in a winter garden. We have lots of perennial plants. We have lots of the strap leaves, a lot of indigenous planting that we've actually introduced into the space as well. So then in summer, because you've got all the blues and the agapanthus and morpholiches and tulbachias and plumbagos and things coming through, the garden cools down even more.
So it's a really gentle space to stay in. But I mean, also what I like here is that you've created focal points, obviously with the convergence of all the paths and people. There is the water feature.
Yeah, and that was something that was done consciously, because you've got all these paths. It's okay to say you've got these entrances and exits and doors and things all over the place, but what happens to these entrances and exits? So what we did is created a practical central hub. That central hub links all the paths together in the center, but also becomes the focal point of the garden. So it's a central focal point.
Okay, but there's also another focal point where the colors are slightly different over yonder. I want to go and see what you've done on the other side of the garden.
Yeah, so just to mention that you say over yonder, the
Yes.
garden actually is in two parts.
Yes.
So we need to have a look at the second one.
Lead on.
From a shaded garden with cool, calm hues to a succulent garden with warmer, energetic colours, this contrasting garden houses the jungle gym with permeable paving underfoot.
This is a garden of two halves, which essentially it is.
Yeah, so I mean, you've got the main entrance, and then you've got that sort of formal garden that we've got on the one side, the garden of grandeur, if you like. And then on the side, we've got the looser, more comfortable, more organic, if you like, in terms of its form, kind of garden. So it's a lot more informal. It's a lot more free flow.
And a lot of succulents, which of course are looking absolutely delightful at the moment.
Yeah, sometimes things are serendipitous. It's not that you design them that way. It's while you're standing on site, you say, well, what would work there. And what we had here on this side, by the way, was a nothing garden. There was just a little bit of scraggly lawn. None of the structure was here. We put this all in. And then we looked at this bank, and there were these old hedges there that just really were not happy. They needed too much watering and stuff, and we thought, well, this just screams succulents. And that's what we did. We put the succulents and rocks here.
And especially when you have these rather large bananas sitting behind us.
Yeah, so that was another thing. And also one of the things we had in this garden was a very good relationship with the client. So the principal of EduInc, for instance, played a large role in coming to me and saying, Mike, what about this, what about that? And we had these discussions. And these strelitzias were here, so what we did is we just stripped them and kept the foliage on the top, and that's such a beautiful design feature with these verticals coming out of the succulent garden. It worked really well.
What I love here is also that the succulents are going to give you that year-round thing as well, because different things will come through with colour at different times of the year.
Yeah, so on the one side we've actually chosen a lot of perennials and things that we knew would just be permanent, in terms of the fact that there's always something there. Here, there's always something here with the succulents, and of course, you've got the aloes flowering right now, which is the right time of the year for them to flower. And by the way, it's a hotter garden.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more funky and vibey for the children. Now, it being a play area doesn't mean they play in the succulents, because it's a backdrop. So, we've got the area where the children can play, but the backdrop is all succulent and rich, and it's got a nice full feeling to it as well. It's a great backdrop.
It's interesting what you say, though. You've got two gardens right next to each other, okay? But the feeling isn't the only thing that's different. It's also the temperature changes and a lot of what is actually going on, because I can feel the difference in temperature between the one garden and the other.
Yeah, that's definitely a cooler space, and this is definitely a warmer space.
Yeah.
And so, you've got your options, which is what I love to do. And I think what's nice, if you look at the way the gardens come together, there are certain plants in this garden that occur in that garden, and they bleed over into this garden. It's what we call the fusion section. So the one garden becomes the other one, but when it becomes its own garden, it's totally different to the one on the other side.
So people shouldn't be too worried about having different themes in different spaces in their gardens either. It doesn't have to be all the same all the way around.
No, I actively encourage it. And it's really just a way of saying, I want this theme and that theme. The challenge to me is, how do I marry them together so that they sort of become one becomes the other one. So it's got to be a comfortable coming together of the gardens, but wow, it's such a groovy idea having different gardens in the space.